really excited to have you all back here today. And I want to get started by introducing our president, Joe Lehman. For those that don't know, or may be joining us for the first time, Joe has been a member of worked with the Mackinac Center going back to 1995, was named president in 2008. During his tenure, Michigan has seen numerous free market policy advances in education, labor, and state fiscal affairs, frequently published in national and state media. Joe has also trained more than 600 public policy executives internationally on strategic leadership and communications. He and his wife are proud founders of the Midland County Habitat for Humanity. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Joe, to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Don, and welcome to all the Mackinac Center supporters out there. I want to let you know that the Mackinac Center is more critical now than ever, that we have this crisis unfolding before us. We went into this crisis very healthy and still remain healthy and financially strong, and we're physically healthy. None of the Mackinac Center's nearly 40 team members has been compromised by the disease, but we're all being quite aggressively cautious, and we've converted to almost an entirely remote operation. And so that continues to work well. And I just want to thank Mackinac Center supporters for continuing to be there for us during this time. I really appreciate calls that I've gotten just inquiring about how things are going, and of course some of the gifts that you've been able to send. Now, we also had to pivot very quickly from our policy agenda that we started 2020 with to almost a singular focus on what everybody is most concerned with now, and that is how to deal with the coronavirus. And our focus is on reopening our society as quickly and safely as possible. And we have been in touch with Governor Whitmer here in Michigan. She had a very strong first 72 hours. She adopted several free market ideas from the Mackinac Center. But we've had our differences since then, and you may have heard about them in the news. But we maintain also strong contact with House and Senate leaders in Michigan as they work together to try to reopen society as quickly as possible. There's some real suffering going on out there. I spoke to a Mackinac Center supporter who went into the pandemic with 30% of his lung capacity, and his words to me were, "If I get this, I'm dead." And he's not down or sad about that. It's just a reality that he has to live with. And so this is how we get to a point which is the topic of our talk today. It's a real life crisis, and as Thomas Jefferson pointed out, government has a tendency to grow, and it is at times of crisis that it can grow a lot, as our guest will tell us today. Now, we do have another event that I'll tell you about before I turn the program over to our speaker. And if you received an invitation to this event, you'll also be receiving one for a talk about COVID-19 across Europe. And that event is noon on this Thursday, May 7th. It will be YouTube live streamed, and it's hosted by the Institute for Economic Affairs, which I like to think of as Margaret Thatcher's favorite think tank, which was influential during her terms there as Prime Minister. So you may tune in for that. I will be a guest on that program. They've got about 3 of us from the United States helping them talk about the worldwide response to COVID. So today, our program is Crisis and Leviathan, Critical Episodes in the Growth of American Government. The book was written 33 years ago by Robert Higgs, and Robert was a close collaborator with today's guest. Today's guest to talk about Dr. Higgs's book is Robert Whaples. Robert is a professor of economics at Wake Forest University and has a long history with our sister think tank, the Independent Institute in California. And Robert Whaples is co-editor and managing editor of its regular publication, the Independent Review. Robert, I'll turn it over to you to tell about Crisis and Leviathan. And I think you'll need to turn your mute off.
Okay. There we go. Thank you for having me on. And before I say anything about Crisis and Leviathan, I've got to point out that I lived in Michigan when I was a youngster in Coldwater, up in Alpena and down in Monroe for about 4 years. And so, well, it's been over 50 years since I lived in Michigan. I do have a close connection to the state. And I have a pretty close connection to Robert Higgs, the author of Crisis and Leviathan. Robert Higgs was an academic economic historian, in fact, what's called a cleometrician, crunching numbers and trying to explain economic history. And I was trained as a cleometrician as well, and I met him back when I was in graduate school, and interestingly then stepped into his shoes when he retired as the editor, longtime editor of the Independent Review. And this book I love, and when the Independent Institute asked that I would talk to some groups about the book, I said that I'd be very willing to, but they needed to do one thing. They needed to send me a new copy of my book, of the book, excuse me. Why? Because my copy is locked in my office, and I've been locked out of my office at Wake Forest University for like a month and a half now. And so they sent me a copy, and I thoroughly enjoyed rereading the book. It is very prescient, and its key point is this. We know that there's a lot of forces out there that have caused government to grow over time. Some of those are benign forces, some of them not so. But the leading sort of academic and just man on the street kind of theories about why government grow have tended to leave out one of the biggest players, and that is crisis. That's why the book is titled Crisis and Leviathan, Critical Episodes in the Growth of American Government. So what Higgs argues is this big picture, that if the conditions are right, if the ideology of the people is right, when a crisis comes along, government won't grow. But if those ideological conditions are wrong, when a crisis comes along, government will grow. And he demonstrates this by taking a very historical approach. So the key argument goes like this. When a crisis breaks out, everybody says, government, do something. We need you to do something. And do it now. And do it before you can even think straight about it. Okay, so government runs out and does something. Often conflicting things are done that, cancel each other out. But government is called upon to step into this. As the crisis grows, the size of the government ratchets up. Then it kind of plateaus at that level as the crisis matures. And then when the crisis is over, the scope of the government, the size of the government goes back down. But it doesn't go all the way back down to what it would have been if the crisis didn't occur. Now, there are some forces that have been causing the scope of government, the size of government, to grow slowly throughout history. So what Higgs thinks of is, here's this upward trajectory. Crisis occurs, we get bigger, and then when it comes back down, it doesn't drop back down to what the old trajectory would be for a number of important reasons. But critical to his book is the idea about what the ideology of the citizenry, of the leaders as well, is at the time of the crisis. Now, Don, I don't know if you're going to be asking me some questions. I can keep going or keep going?
Well, Robert, what I'd like to, you've really set us up beautifully.
Yeah.
And a great transition from Joe. So if you could give us maybe a broad overview of, let's say, starting with World War I, how historically these crises have continued to grow the size of government. And then we'll get into more
Yeah.
specific details.
To answer that question, in fact, Higgs points out that we need to start before World War I because we need to see a crisis where government didn't grow. And the crisis that he begins with is the crisis of the 1890s. In the 1890s, people don't even hear about this or think about this much anymore. There was a major economic depression, second only in size to the Great Depression itself. But the ideology of the people at the time and of the leaders at the time were that, well, let me just kind of look down to the bottom of my body there. I noticed that I have 2 feet, and I'm capable of standing on those 2 feet and carrying myself. That was the ideology of people at the time. So President Grover Cleveland, who kind of emerges as the hero of the book, when this crisis hits, says, no, it's not the job of the government to step in and solve these problems that people can solve themselves. Instead, the role of the government is to do things as minimally and as economically as possible and not to waste the people's resources. It is never the job of the government, said Cleveland, to support the people. The people must support the government to do these jobs that only government can do, but it is not the job of government to support the people. The people can support themselves. And Higgs quotes from a famous veto message of Cleveland, who vetoed more acts than anyone else, the Texas Seed Bill. So there was a drought in Texas, and Congress passed this very small act, $10,000 of money to give the poor Texas, farmers some seeds. Cleveland vetoed that. He said, no, the government doesn't support the people. The people can support themselves. And so it ended up that people contributed to charity and they got more than $10,000 and whatever. But that was the ideology at the time. And Higgs says this, an ideology can act kind of as a lever or as a straitjacket. And if you wanted government to be bigger, ideology is acting as a straitjacket here. Our way of thinking is, no, this is just not what government does. This is not what government should do, can do. We don't have a history of government doing this. It's the wrong way to respond. Okay, so the people who wanted a bigger government saw this as a straitjacket, and they wanted to use government as a lever to do things. Okay, well, during the 1890s, as things emerged, right, there was the populist campaign. There was William Jennings Bryan running for president on, need to add silver to gold, need to have some inflation. Okay, they lost, but shortly after the turn of the century, the progressive movement swept through American politics on both the Democratic side and on the Republican side. So, Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive. He was a Republican. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive. He was a Democrat. It swept through. And by the time we got to World War I, facing a different kind of crisis, there was just an entirely different mindset in place. And that mindset was that we are asking government to do more and more, and government is capable of doing this. Higgs's argument is that this was largely a top-down thing. It was the well-educated college professor types who were saying, we know enough now that we can rebuild society, rebuild the economy, rebuild the political system, and make things better. We know how to do that. It's not clear they actually did know how to do that, but they convinced people that they knew how to do that and started passing lots of legislative acts as part of the progressive agenda. And so by the time World War I hit, just this new mindset was in place. And we could have fought World War I this way. Could have fought it like, okay, we need soldiers to go off and fight in Europe. They need all sorts of supplies. And so you want to go fight? We'll pay you to go fight. Of course, you'd have to pay somebody a lot of money to go out and, risk getting shot at and blown up. We need munitions. We need ships. We need all this stuff. Just pay people and they'll go out and produce them. But that's not how the government responded. Instead of responding through a market system, they responded through a control and command system, right? They commandeered resources, especially labor. They said, hey, there's a war to be fought. You've got to go off and fight. We're going to pay you $417 a year to go off and fight. And of course, there's been a lot of inflation since then, but that was a low amount even then. That was less than basically anybody's getting paid for a job there. So we're going to force you. We're going to hide costs. We're going to impose them on other people and then we're going to drum up all sorts of fervor so that it's your duty to go off and do this. And if you were a strong supporter of the war, of course, that's the way you were thinking, that we need everybody to make this kind of sacrifice. Take one for the team, go off and do that. And then government took over the entire economy. They started allocating the key resources. If you wanted to produce something that was in huge consumer demand, you probably couldn't do it because the government wouldn't give you the resources you needed to do it. The steel, the coal, the whatever you needed to produce. And eventually the government took over the entire railroad system. So imagine the entire transportation system being taken over by the government. And then what Higgs argues is that by the end of the war, and of course we were only in the fighting phase of the war for about a year and a half, and the government didn't ramp these big efforts up until, largely into 1918 itself. So these programs were in place for about a year or so. And then as the war ended, they started to go away, but the government now had a permanently bigger role in the economy than it ever would before, right? Because ideologies were changing. And people were thinking, well, government did a pretty good job. Of course, the longer they thought about this after the war, the less convinced they were of that. But there were also key irreversible changes that occurred, like court rulings. Can government do these things? Well, when the cases came to the Supreme Court, men like Oliver Wendell Holmes made arguments like, no, government can't do this kind of thing any other time, but during a crisis they can do it. And so that's what their thinking was. The government has to do this. We're going to have to change all the legal precedents so that now government can do these kinds of things. And of course, the agencies were there. And trying to pull the plug on a government agency, boy, that is a very difficult task, if only because there's a bunch of advocates out there for the agency, the people who work for it, the people who benefit from it. And so they know everybody on Capitol Hill, right? They were probably pretty prominent people themselves to get these positions. They've got these connections, and they don't want the right. And so the benefits from these agencies are very focused on certain people, including those who work for it. But the cost of these government programs are very diffuse across all the different taxpayers across the economy. And so that's the perfect recipe, economic theory would say, for giving you a bigger government. Put these little costs spread across everybody and concentrated benefits on a handful of people, and it's going to be very difficult for these agencies to go away. And that's exactly the experience we had during World War I.
Thank you for that great explanation, Robert. And I want to dive into that very subject matter that you finished with, which was about these how emergency powers essentially extend authorities and powers that were perhaps not found in the respective state or federal constitution. And then you get these bureaucracies or new institutions that get set up to deal with crises. Are these institutions ever folded up? Are they ever actually shut down once the crisis is over? In the book, we see an example with the Taft-Hartley Act, and talks to something that we at the Mackinac Center have been working on for decades now, which is trying to roll back the influence of labor unions. And that is a byproduct of the Taft-Hartley Act, which comes out of one of these crises. So if you could talk a bit about how many of these institutions, or do they ever fold up once the crisis is over, at least in the public side?
Yeah, once in a while you do see actual agencies fold up and disappear. But you're right. It's very, very difficult to do this because what happens is, like, once things have changed, these agencies try to reinvent themselves, right? They don't want to give up their power. And so the initial conditions weren't there, and they see other problems that they can solve. And, they start telling everybody, no, here's our new agenda. And so in terms of what you were talking about with the labor movement, I think it predates Taft-Hartley that you were talking about. It goes back more to the Wagner Act from the part of the New Deal. Taft-Hartley was actually meant to rein in a little bit the Wagner Act. But, that was a model for a completely different economy than we have now. That was the economy of the early 20th century. We're now at the early 21st century. And that was an economy where there were a lot of people who were doing kind of routine jobs over and over and over again, jobs that are pretty boring and, also can be very backbreaking. And those kinds of jobs, often workers are going to leave the job not only very tired, but kind of disgruntled for doing what they do. And they're going to be thinking about an us versus them mentality, as you saw for, workers working for Henry Ford and that kind of stuff. That is so different from the mentality of almost every workplace in the United States today, where things are far more collaborative. We're working as part of a team and all that stuff. And yet the legacy of that thing hangs on for, closing in on a century now. So yes, it takes a long, long time for these agencies to go away. Sometimes they do. But, if you wrote a book about agencies like that stayed around and one about agencies that disappear, it would just be such a dramatically, short reading list for the agencies that have disappeared.
The Mackinac Center made famous a theory called the Overton window, developed by Joseph Overton, which talks about the theory of what is politically possible within policy change. Do you see a nexus between the Overton window, as the Mackinac Center has detailed it, and what is detailed in Crisis and Leviathan?
Yeah. And so, windows of opportunity that are open, you see them in business, you see them in politics, you see them all the way. Who's going to be able to get through that window in the short period of time that the window is open? It's people who are planning for it, who are waiting for it, waiting for the next window to open. They've got an agenda already, and, they've got all these plans already, and then when the crisis comes out, they say, here it is, I got the solution, right? And they're going to be, they're going to be the ones who are the first to act on this. And so that is a key theme of Higgs's book, Crisis and Leviathan. Why did we see the response that we saw during the Great Depression? It was because of World War I. During World War I, we had all those government agencies that came along and did all sorts of things running the economy. And the people that worked in those agencies were just champing at the bit to get another shot to do it. And so when the crisis came along, a whole different kind of crisis came along about a decade later, they said, let's just dust off all those old plans and let's bring the gang back together. And here we go. We got a solution. And the solutions they had were all over the place. Many of them made the problem worse. Some of them made it better. Some of them canceled each other out. But I'm in entire agreement with you that it's like Rahm Emanuel famously said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And so he said that in the early 1990s after Higgs wrote this book, not too much longer after. I guess early 2000s, excuse me, it was during Obama. So I guess it was already 2008. But that's the kind of quote that Higgs would open one of the chapters with, although he digs into very good sources and has a lot of very interesting quotes. But I think that Overton window theory meshes incredibly well with the Crisis and Leviathan theory. If you haven't planned for the crisis, then you're not going to be able to ratchet up the size of government. And you want the crisis to last longer. The longer it lasts, the more you can get these kind of things in, the deeper their roots can go, and the harder it is going to be able to pull them back out.
One of the other philosophers, we could say, that has provided inspiration to a lot of government overreach through the centuries has been Hegel. In a simple manner, the Hegelian dialectic goes problem, reaction, solution. How much of that are we seeing play out in this crisis, and how much are we seeing it? Have we seen it play out in previous crises in this country?
I think there's a fair degree of that going on, but also Higgs points out very well is it's not just crises that everyone would agree is a crisis, but then once you see that that's the lever you need a crisis to get your agenda through, you start trumping everything up to make it sound like it's a crisis, right? And so it turns into kind of the crisis of the month. Sometimes you get crisis fatigue, but everything, that's what people do. They advertise this thing as a crisis. This one's going to be worse than the last one was. And so in terms of, like, how do you stop this cycle from playing out? What we have to do is we need to steal some pages from their playbook, the way I see it. We need to have, and we do, have agendas sitting there ready to go so that if this kind of crisis breaks out, here we go. We can explain what's going on, like taking the book Crisis in Leviathan and dusting it off in a time of crisis. But we need to have a set of plans ready to go, because what Higgs argues so effectively is the key determinant here is ideology. And at any point in time, ideology is pretty much set, but it changes over time. And an ideology is not a dirty word at all. Anybody who is sane, says Higgs, has to have an ideology to live by, right? A worldview of what social interactions should be like. And so what we need to do is have a set of responses for every potential crisis under the sun. That's what we in think tanks, that's what our job is. It's a long-term fight, because the other side is always going to be trumping up some kind of crisis, and we've got to explain why that's not a crisis, or if it is actually a crisis, why this response is better than the response that they're trumpeting, which is always bigger government, more power to government, less power to individuals. So I was thinking, is there a world in which, when this pandemic started to sweep across the United States, the citizens wouldn't have just rolled over for all of this stuff, these emergency powers that we've seen doled out to all these authorities, and not just on the state level, but I think on the national level, it's been pretty bad as well. Like adding to the standard unemployment insurance that's there, these extra provisions so that you get paid money on top of that. And so you can make far more money being unemployed than you can be having a job. When my battery died, because my car hasn't been driving around very much lately, and the AAA guy came to jump it and recharge it, he said, I said to my boss, could you lay me off? I'd be earning more money if I was unemployed than if I had this job. And here I am standing out in the rain doing this. Right? So can we imagine a world in which, when a crisis like this came along, people didn't run to the government and say, hey, give me some extra money to fill in for, because I lost my job. Hey, take away all these rights that I have, like freedom of movement and going to a store and going to visit my family and friends. And can we imagine a world? And I think the only way you could imagine that world is if we could push the ideological tide in the other direction, so that people were prepared for this, and even if they were going to take somewhat of a hit themselves economically, they were in a position where they would say, that's the way it works. That's the way it should work. We shouldn't have government mortgage our future to bail us out of this temporary problem. So, for example, what would you do if you were in a world like that, and you thought that is the way the world should work, because that works better, that leads to more human flourishing? It's not just that it makes my wallet fatter. No, it leads to more meaningful lives. How would you react? One way you would react, I think, one way people would react is to not have their bank accounts evaporate down to zero the day before my next paycheck comes in. Instead, would to have some kind of nest egg put over to the side, right? So that if there's a crisis, now I can rely on my own resources. And it wouldn't just be, a credit card that I can charge. It would be for an adult, some tens of thousands of dollars sitting there that I can reach in a time of crisis, so that I can keep paying the bills that I need to and don't need to run to the government to do it. Okay? The ideological game would be so much different if people prepared for the future that way themselves, instead of saying, no, I'm not going to do that, because the government's going to step in and they're going to pay off all of my bills and, the future be damned. Who cares about the next generation or my children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren who are eventually going to have to pick up the tab for it. That's how we would react. That is one way that we would react differently, I think.
How much of a role does sudden heightened fear from the general public play a role in this type of these government solutions? So if the reaction is what we're seeing by the public, how much does that heightened fear play a role in the solutions that we then get in return? You kind of alluded to that a little bit.
Yeah, hang on. And so, one key point that Higgs makes in the book is that this heightened fear is not a random thing, that there are agents out there whose job it is to heighten fear. And they're the very people who want to step in and grab the emergency powers. They make the problem seem as bad as it can so that they get the power to solve the problem. And they realize that down the road, people aren't going to scrutinize every single thing they did. They're going to say, there was a crisis. Did they act? Yes, they acted. Good. Was it the right way to act? I'm too busy to notice. And so I think we got to be very aware that there's agents of change out there that are in power. They're not passive actors. Now, did that answer the question the way you thought I was going to answer the question, or was there something else you were alluding to?
Yeah, no, that really gets to the heart of it. And what it leads into is, and I've seen one of the questions in the chat room is, how much does the 24/7 news cycle, the cable news, really add another layer of heightened public fear to, as you said, those interests that want to see an solution?
Yeah. It only makes it worse as far as I can tell. And it doesn't matter, what side of the political spectrum you were looking at. Everybody was, how am I going to get people to click on my website? Because the clicks sell. I'm going to have these outrageous headlines. I'm going to have these things about how horrible things are, because that's what people are going to click on. And so a lot of that, again, falls on us, because we're the ones doing the clicking. If whatever website you went to puts all this stuff up and you didn't click on it, they'd have to start changing what they put up there pretty quick. And, I admit that in the early weeks of this, I was like, oh my gosh, this could be really bad. And I was clicking on one negative story after another. And eventually I was like, this is getting boring. I'm getting crisis fatigue already. And I don't even go to most of those websites anymore. And I think that's the right way for us to respond. I'm not sure how long it would take them to catch on to it. But, we cannot look past ourselves as part of the problem.
One of the topics discussed in the book is the loss of mutual aid societies and private institutions that fall by the wayside as these crises emerge. So then when the next crisis emerges, those private institutions are no longer available to fill those gaps that are now being filled by government. Could you speak to a little bit about that?
Yeah, that is a very crucial point. There are so many historians and social theorists who go, the reason that we had big government was these old ways of solving problems. The mutual aid societies, fraternal societies, churches, families, they were starting to wither, and government had to fill in for these as the modern world came along. Higgs slams that argument. He pulls the rug out from underneath it. He said that's not the way it happened at all. These institutions were as robust as ever when we came into the progressive era. And what government did instead was fought against these things. Maybe not in those terms per se, but they knew that they were rivals for power. And so they put in places institutions that would harm the mutual aid societies, the churches, the families, so that people would have to depend more and more on government. And I think there's very good evidence for that. I've actually done some research on these mutual aid societies. They're fascinating. The paper that I published on this uses data from the Michigan furniture industry, no less. And there were major, what did workers do back in the day? They got together and they formed these self-help organizations so that if somebody got sick, right, and government wasn't around to give you insurance, if you had medical bills, government was around to do this, they would help each other. And these mutual aid societies were often part of a bigger package of fraternal organizations where we go and we hang around together, we socialize together, and we help each other in time of crisis. These things, mutual aid societies were covering well over half of the population during their heyday in the early 20th century, and they were working very effectively at the point where government stepped in and started to undercut them.
How much, what we see a little bit differently in this crisis is that most of the government overreaches are coming from state and local government institutions. So we're actually seeing federalism in action.
Uh-huh.
What are your thoughts about this crisis and how most of the overreaches are actually coming from the bottom up and not necessarily the top down, especially in Michigan?
I think that this has to do with, the structure of government that's in place at the time the crisis hit, and that is who has the, police power to step in during a public health emergency. That has been a power that has been, part of state sovereignty from the beginning. And so I think ultimately, even though there's been an immense amount of overreach here, this will be a good thing, because instead of just having one size fits all, federal government setting all the rules, we've got 50 different solutions here, and we can see, hey, here's what the other state's doing. Oh, these guys are doing this, and it's working out pretty well. Over in Europe, there's like 20 whatever different countries you can compare yourself to. But we're Americans. We don't compare ourselves to anybody else. Are we comparing ourselves to Canada? No. But what we can see is how's Michigan doing it versus how Ohio's doing it versus North Carolina or Colorado or something like that. And that's what I think is leading to a lot of the pressure on the states that have been overdoing it. They see that in neighboring states, they're doing something that is helping solve the problem in a far more efficient way, in a far less economically damaging way, and people can just point to it. And so that laboratory of federalism, I think, is still alive, and that will be, I think, one of the legacies of this as we unpack it in years to come. We'll be able to point to the states that did it well and the ones that didn't do it well. And I think there'll be a reaction, as there was in the 1920s to the, overdoing of government running the economy during World War I. But the only way to ratchet things all the way back down, or even further than when we started, is if we just push. The think tanks and, news organizations and individuals just keep push, and don't let them sell the story that they came in like a knight on shining armor and solved this problem when they didn't. That's our job. We are in the ideology business. It's not a dirty word, and what we have to do is just become as effective communicators on this as possible. If we see people on the other side of the arguments doing things effectively, well, what we need to do is borrow their style, but not their substance and their arguments.
One of the positives we've seen come out of this is a rollback of regulations on the healthcare side, on the delivery of certain consumer goods like alcohol. Now, that's a positive outtake of this. How much of that do you think may actually stay in play once this crisis is over? So we talked about how a lot of the negative institutions stay in play after the crisis ends. Well, might we see a rollback of government regulations that keeps some of those positive deregulatory things in play?
And I think that you take the same arguments from Crisis and Leviathan, which say that once you've made a change, it's hard to undo the change. Once a change has been made, now there's a constituency to keep that. It works both ways. And so I think you're right. If I can now get, if I used to have to go to an ABC store to get this stuff, but they made a waiver and I can get it actually delivered to my house, I'm going to, after the crisis is over, like, okay, why are we going to undo this now? It didn't work out so bad, and there will be a constituency that way, and I think it will wear it down. But only if you keep the pressure on.
You spoke about this earlier. What can history teach us about the ideological changes that happen amongst the general public once a crisis like this is over, and how that affects future crises?
Yep. And so, remember, Higgs says that ideology is like a straitjacket and like a lever, and you want it to be both, right? And you don't want people to be able to do anything in a time of crisis, immoral, bad, destructive things. So you better have an ideology that restrains you from doing things. But you also want to be able to have extra leverage when there is a time of crisis. The problem is when we come off of a crisis we have learned some new lessons. Government can do this, but we've also unlearned some old lessons. Markets can do this even better. Okay, so this is one of Higgs's key arguments from World War I, right? Government took over the railroad system and ran it. And people were like, hey, the government can run the railroad system. Let's just have them do it forever. They do it over in Europe. But why did that government take over the railroad system? First, there were all these bad policies in place before that were starving the railroads of investment. And government was making it so difficult for a railroad to be run efficiently and to earn a profit that people weren't pouring money back in and building the infrastructure and whatever. So the railroads were already kind of in iffy shape because of bad government regulations. And then government got to allocate all the resources, and they allocated resources in ways that made the railroads run even more efficiently. That made the railroads run even more inefficiently. So let's ruin the railroads. Let's wreck the railroads, then step in and act as though somehow we resurrected the railroads. Okay, but my point is that we need to learn the right lessons from these crises. Not that government can do this, but government versus markets. There are some things that governments can do better. There's many more things that markets can do better, right? We've got to learn the right lessons, and the only way to learn the right lessons is to analyze things afterwards and then get those results out to people. And that's what think tanks like ours are all about. We can't just leave the narrative to the other side, because who dominates government and academia and, not just higher education, but I learned in my history books growing up, basically the progressive worldview of history. That's all they were teaching in the junior high and high school history books. Government getting bigger and bigger, that was the solution there. So we've got to do something to wrestle back those commanding heights of the culture from the people who are telling the history wrong, right? And so we've got to get it so people don't learn the wrong lessons, the incorrect lessons from these crises.
Well, that sounds like a great opportunity for think tanks to step in and
Yeah.
not only educate their supporters, but obviously educate legislators about learning the right lessons from this. I want to turn to some of the questions we have in the chat room. First one from Rich Weber. Rich cites safety as a reason why, as a major driver behind the slippery slope of the loss of rights. And he has personal experiences of this, as he cites in the chat room. What are your thoughts on the public health, using public health and safety as a driver of a lot of these loss of rights?
Yeah. Safety is a luxury. When you're really poor, you can't afford to do those things that protect your safety. You've got to go out and take risks, right? And so as our economy has gotten wealthy and wealthier over time, we have the luxury of demanding more safety. But like anything else, as you get more and more of it, it gets more and more expensive to produce. And so I think the key point here is that we're in a position now to do things that are very expensive, to get just a little bit extra safety. Where a generation or two before, people would go, no, that's just too expensive. There's no way you could afford to do that. So, for example, let's take the last time a big virus like this crippled the American economy, which is not the Spanish flu of 1918, 1919, like we keep hearing about. It was the Asian flu of 1957. In 1957, this flu came in, and it had the total number of excess deaths from it were into the hundreds of thousands. And parts of the economy ended up getting shut down. Auto factories, for example. So many of the workers were sick, they shut down. And we fell into a recession. But it was a short recession, and then we bounced right back from it because we didn't try to shut down the whole economy. It wasn't even on the agenda one bit. Nobody would have thought about shutting down the economy to do something to make things safer. What if this same crisis had hit 1990, how would we have responded? 2000, how would we would have responded in a much different way. The big thing that's changed in the interim is we keep getting wealthier, but our technology keeps changing. So we can do things remotely like we're doing right now that we couldn't have done 20 years ago at all, right? And so now that there's these ways to buy some extra safety by doing all this kind of social distancing, right, we start trying it. And we find it to be very expensive, but we're rich, we can afford it. And we're not always that rich that we can afford all as much as we've done. So, but I think the broad point that I'm trying to make is that we can afford more and more safety, and we have more and more technologies that allow us to do these things remotely than we were before. And so I think that if we run into other crises like this in the future, we will have learned that lesson, which is that that people want more safety, and we've got to worry about how much that's going to damage the overall economy when we do it. Not sure if I answered that question well enough. Yeah.
I agree with your sentiments. Next question is from Jerry Stratton. Jerry asks, are there any examples of crises in which the government grew and then gave that growth back in its entirety?
So one could maybe make that case or close to it for the Civil War. In fact, that swamps every crisis we've talked about. The magnitude of the impact that had on everybody's lives. And after the war, the government gave almost basically all the power back. The federal government size got massive during the war. And then if you look at total number of federal employees and what the government was doing after the war, it shrank down about to what it had been before. And I think it just had to do with the people looking down and seeing that they had 2 feet at the bottom of their body. And the people, that was just the mindset then, especially when everybody was like a yeoman farmer and all that kind of stuff. And you were raised on that. All right, young man, get up, and I know you're 5 years old now. You can start doing things that are going to help. And so you just have that kind of mindset. And you don't think that it's the job of somebody else to take care of you, right? Instead, there's kind of 2 big competing worldviews out there. One of these worldviews says that my purpose in life is to take care of myself and to take care of the other people that I have been given to take care of. It's my job. And the mark of a good man, a good woman, is to give more than they get. I think that's what parents certainly think, right? Everybody used to agree with that point of view, just about. My job is not to be a taker, but to be a giver. Okay. Now, then these forces come in and they twist that around and put it on its head. Oh, yes, you must be a giver. And you're going to be forced to give, and you're going to be forced to give to these other people that aren't your own family members, and and they're entitled to these things. And so they twist that idea around, and more people start buying that idea that, in fact, it's perfectly legitimate. It's a good idea. It's a great way to live through life, to get more than you give. And we did that sometime after the Civil War, moving up into the 20th century. We did that. It's a very sad thing.
That's a great answer. Next question is from Dave Pizziali. I think we answered Dave's first question about the media as a driver of the public reaction to it. But his next question is about the CDC, and I'll make it a little bit more broad, but how do we keep government agencies in check on being mission focused? In other words, keeping them focused on what they were created to do as opposed to getting into other areas that they were not created to do. And as we've seen play out here in this crisis, perhaps not addressing infectious disease in a way that they should have.
Yeah. And so I think that the one way to approach that is to have what's called a polycentric system rather than a monocentric system. Instead of there being one entity that's in charge, you could have multiple entities that are competing with each other to be in charge. The CDC doesn't have a monopoly. There are other sources of knowledge about those kinds of things out there. Maybe it's another government agency, or maybe it's some private entities, not the kind of private entity that receives all their funding from the CDC, but somebody with their own with their own source of power. Then that when somebody comes out, as happened early in this crisis, and says, "Look at these projections, millions of people are going to die in the United States," they would say, "Okay, step back. Here's an assumption, here's an assumption, here's an assumption. I think these assumptions are okay. I think these ones are off." And they would offer competing narratives to this, competing expertise. That's what you need, competing sources of expertise and some power that goes with those expertise, so that the ones who actually get to do the job better are the ones that thrive more and we turn to more, without letting them turn into the one and only source of power and knowledge on that subject. Decentralization.
Next question is from Bob Emick. Bob asks, is the same scenario playing out with our healthcare system? Is the system essentially being wrecked to then be rebuilt and taken over by another government agency or another government institution?
I can see a decent amount of that being done, and I think the best solution to that is to get government as much as possible out of that business. Yeah.
Final question from the audience is from Jerry Stratton. This question is, are we seeing different reactions, and I'm going to add this to Jerry's question, are we seeing different reactions from the public based on who can and cannot work remotely? So you and I can work remotely, but a lot of workers can't, and their jobs have to be done in person. Working remotely is a great technological advancement and great for some families. But for others, it is just not a possibility.
Yeah.
Is that the role in the public reaction and the divergent public reaction?
Yeah, I think that's entirely true. And in kind of going back to that earlier answer I had about how the technology has changed, who has more say, who has more sway in these things? It's elites, it's people with higher educations and those in these top positions. If we weren't, if people like us, people with letters behind their names, weren't able to, work remotely, I think we would have way more of a push to do things to get the economy going. I think there's just a big disconnect between the people who are making these decisions and a lot of average people out there in the economy who cannot work remotely. Yes.
And I think we seeing that play out based on the reactions in different cities. So in many of the cities that have a lot of remote workers or high-tech workers that can do this work remotely, they are far more open to being placed under further government restrictions, whereas those that really need to be out in their businesses are much more apt to be pushing back against those restrictions.
I don't understand how governors came up with their lists of what we're going to let people do and what we're not going to let them do, what's essential, what's non-essential, whatever. And it was Michigan that I was reading about. I had some work done on my kitchen a few months ago, and so, my kitchen's like all torn apart. Had this happened right when the pandemic occurred, the governor then says that guy can't come over to my house and finish the project up. So he's out of a job. He's out of a job, and I'm out of a kitchen for how long, right? Who in their right mind thought that through and thought that this would be a wise idea? That there were going to be a lot of germs being spread around when some contractor comes out and does something like that. That's just a total disconnect. I hope I'm not mischaracterizing what I read about Michigan, but yeah. Amazing.
The terminology being used that is equally dangerous, essential versus non-essential. In my personal opinion, that's pretty dangerous terminology to throw around given people's livelihoods, either essential or non-essential, when we know that a job is essential to everyone putting food on the table, paying their bills.
Yeah, and more than that, too, that's not what jobs are just about. They're also about giving your life a purpose. And so when we look at studies of people and how they respond to unemployment, there's this whole cottage industry in social sciences looking at subjective well-being, self-reported, happiness, well-being, whatever. When people lose a job, when they're unemployed, their happiness drops by far, far more than the amount of money they earn would suggest that it drops. Losing your job is the equivalent in terms of a hit to your happiness of like getting divorced. Okay? So this is pretty serious stuff. And any policy we have that creates unemployment is about the worst policy that we can have. Because it's not just that it's harming you psychologically, that then starts to harm you in your physiology, in your immune system, right? When you're in a position like that, social isolation causes all sorts of health problems. It certainly does. And I think all they're worried about is what are my poster numbers going to be about how many COVID deaths I have. If there's other health problems that arise from that, they couldn't even care less about it, as far as I could see, these governors. So.
And I agree wholeheartedly with that further explanation. It's one of the reasons that have been posited as to how President Trump was elected, which was people putting a lot of importance on that dignity of having a job. That has been an argument made by other economists that that is something that they saw in the voting populace in 2016. I want to thank you, Dr. Whaples, for such a great presentation. Really enjoyed it. We had some really great Q&A as well. Thank you to the audience for the questions. Dr. Whaples, where can we find your work if others want to find your work going forward?
Yeah, I think probably the best place to go is to the website of the Independent Institute. And so just Google my last name, Whaples, and Independent Institute, and it'll take you to see our think tank. But also there's a tab for me, and you can click on. You can see a number of other talks and presentations I've done, including one of my favorite talks ever on the strengths and weaknesses of capitalism that I gave at the Acton Institute there in Grand Rapids a couple of years ago. So lots of other things you can see there.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Whaples. We really appreciate the time, and thank you for all the work that you do at the Independent Institute, and thank you to the Independent Institute for promoting this great work by Robert Higgs. So I want to turn, before we wrap up here in final 2 minutes, I want to let everyone know that next week's event will be an event featuring the Michigan Chamber of Commerce, where we're going to talk about re-energizing the Michigan economy going forward. As we move away from this crisis and try to get people back to work and get the economy working again. And you'll be looking for more details on that on our events page at mackinac.org. And you'll see an email that will go out giving you instructions on how to register for that event. This event will be available via video on our YouTube channel and on our webpage. And you'll be able to share that with friends and family, or if there's anything you missed or want to go back to and share that will be made available in the next day or two, and you'll get an update on that as well. And as we promised at the beginning of today's event, we were going to be picking 5 audience members at random to receive a copy of Crisis and Leviathan, and want to announce those now. The names are Lynn Halverson, Bob Emmerich, Jerry Stratton, Rich Weber, and Dave Pizziali. I'm an Italian too, so I can pronounce that name. Dave Pizziali are the winners of today's giveaway. And if you could just stay on to make sure that we have your email address so we can arrange to have those books sent to you, we will do so. So for the rest of you out there, you can see it pays to ask questions in the chat box, because that's who many of our winners were. So thank you again for a great talk, Dr. Whaples, and we will see you all next Tuesday for our event with the Michigan Chamber of Commerce. Thank you. Stay safe, be well, and enjoy your week.